Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the responder and representation. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying AQA A-level media studies. There's currently a set text on that specification. The set episode for study is series 1, episode 1, so that's what I'm going to focus on here. We'll start by having a look at the representation of police within the episode. Most of the screen time is on the police, and so we do get the idea that they are the most important characters, and certainly we get the idea that Martin Freeman's character is the kind of hero or the protagonist of this series. But his job as a police officer is represented as very challenging. In the beginning, the dialogue, he says, "I want to be a good Bobby." So he's represented as wanting to do well, quite eager. But it's very clear throughout the episode that this is not going to be easy, that being a police officer is challenging. We see that he has a reasonably good relationship with the public. He knows a lot of the people that he deals with on a regular basis. He knows that the boy has no dad. He jokes with the girl about her dog. He said, you need my help. So it's clear that he has a good relationship and he does know the people that he's dealing with. But we also see him stealing cigarettes, stealing drugs, taking bribes. It's very clear that he's corrupt. He's in therapy sessions. And at the end, we see really long take of him crying. So the idea is that being a police officer is represented as a very difficult job, and it's very difficult to do well. However, despite all of this, the audience is encouraged to sympathise with him. So he's by no means a kind of totally clean-cut hero. He's very much a flawed hero. He does save Casey from violence. He gives her money and tries to get her out of a life of crime. The fact that he steals the drugs, but he steals them for his sick mother, it somehow makes his crime seem better. So the representation of him as a police officer is really quite complicated, and it's not simple. And audiences might really enjoy some quite complex representations where everything is not just a simple stereotype. It's very conventional for the heroes or detectives of crime drama series to be flawed in some way. Let's have a look at the representation of criminals as well. Criminals are represented as pretty violent, pretty emotional, losing their temper, being quite angry, quite aggressive. They're mostly men as well, which I guess reinforces the representations of men in the episode. Although we do get female criminals as well, but they are mostly quite young, mostly white. They're very mixed up with each other, mixed up with the police. We see them aggressive, we see them yelling, we see drug dealers carrying hammers. So criminals are seen as quite dangerous, aggressive, something to perhaps fear, some people that are challenging to deal with. At some points, we are encouraged to sympathise with a few of the characters, for example, Casey, but at the end, she's selling drugs again at the end. She doesn't get on the train like she says she's going to, so she hasn't changed. So our sympathy as an audience is quite short-lived. We're encouraged to see criminals as being incapable of changing their lives for the better. And actually, at the start of the episode, we see him getting this phone call that he has to deal with from a couple who are obviously having a kind of domestic fight. And at the end of the episode, there is another phone call from the same couple. So they haven't changed either. So criminals are seen as people who have difficult lives, but don't really do anything to help themselves. Let's have a look at the representation of men within the episode. Obviously, the episode is dominated by men, which again might help to target a male audience, but it may also suggest that police and criminals are predominantly men and that women don't necessarily have as big a place in this world as they do. It's quite patriarchal. We do see him at the start as being quite close to his daughter, so joking around, reading her stories. But we also see him as being aggressive, losing his temper, bashing a hole in the door. So, men represented as being a bit of a mixed bag, caring and emotional, but also dangerous and aggressive. We see shots of him in therapy, which again is, a positive thing. Men discussing their emotions is something that is often not thought about in society. But the fact that in therapy he's crying a lot, losing his temper, getting quite angry, it makes him seem quite mentally tortured. And this idea of mental health as being an issue for men is something that's increasingly a problem in society. men not getting help for their mental health issues. He seems very reluctant to get help for his mental health issues as well. And this perhaps reinforces this idea that men don't want to talk about their emotions. His mental health is obviously represented as being very unstable, and you get the use of media language to reinforce this, the jump cuts, the very non-linear narrative. It's very fractured, very chaotic. They layer the sounds and they also play around with the volume of the diegetic sound as well. We lose all the diegetic sound at one point. So really reinforcing his very unstable mental health issues. The young boy that we see crying over his grandma, again, this makes him seem quite emotional, quite caring, challenges our ideas about young men in particular. Martin Freeman's character does comfort him and does seem quite caring and emotional. And again, this challenges stereotypes of men being unemotional and uncaring. And we see male cops supporting each other, asking questions. So the representations of men are quite complex. We see lots of emotions, lots of talking about mental health, lots of caring representations, but we're also seeing those fairly stereotypical representations of aggressiveness and violence. Let's have a look at the representation of women in the episode too. Start off and we see his wife serving breakfast, makes her seem quite domestic, which is fairly stereotypical representation of women. His therapist is female as well, so again, perhaps reinforcing this idea that women are good at talking, they're good at communication, they're good at talking about emotions. And his wife clearly wants him to talk about his feelings as well. She asks him several times to talk about how he's feeling. There are some female police officers represented in the episode, but they are much more minor characters. They're given very little dialogue and they're not really respected as characters either. So for example, the female police officer, she's seen as much less experienced. She asks a lot of questions and it's clear from the male police officers' reactions that they don't really think she's got enough experience to know the answers to these questions. The representations of gender in this series also very closely linked to the representations of ethnicity, which is something that Bell Hooks theorises. So as well as being very patriarchal, the episode does seem to treat ethnic minorities as being lesser or marginalised. There is only one black character. She's not treated with a huge amount of respect. And the vast majority of the characters in the episode are white. The female police officer actually says, "I don't have a place here." So reinforcing this idea that women don't feel like they fit into the police force. So perhaps representing the police force as quite a patriarchal world and women as not being cut out for it. Casey as a character assumes that he wants to have sex with her as a police officer. And perhaps this reflects the way women are treated in society as sex objects, the way that they are objectified, and the way that they're often abused by the system or by people with power. We'll have a look at the representation of place, for example, Liverpool. It's seen as quite run down, quite grimy. You get these quite social realist type representations of it. So we see drugs, kind of council estates, lots of violence. Some of the other settings include places like strip clubs. We see lots of homeless people on the streets. It's a fairly stereotypical representation of a northern English city, but it definitely feels quite depressing. And, you know, perhaps this representation is going to put off some people who live in places like Liverpool, but it's certainly very recognisable as a stereotype to people who don't live in Liverpool, and so perhaps makes it quite easy for the audiences to understand. But having these quite depressing, gritty representations of place are quite common within police dramas. If we have a look at the representation of age, older people represented in fairly stereotypical ways. The pensioner, for example, the grandma, she dies alone. And we often see older people as represented as being very isolated and lonely. In fact, his elderly mum is seen in a care home, and although he does visit her, again, this perhaps might represent old people as being fairly isolated and dependent on others for care. Young people have fairly stereotypical representations in this episode, involved in drugs, involved in crime, reckless behaviour. The younger police officer is not taken seriously. She's seen as very naive. So perhaps with age comes respect. Casey laughs at his advice and it kind of suggests that she doesn't respect him. The young people don't take adults very seriously. The older adults tend to be a little bit more responsible. So we're seeing obviously the adult police officers in positions of power and status. In fact, most of the adults in the episode seem to be represented in just as much of a negative way as the young people in the episode. They're also involved in crime. They also display signs of aggression and instability. And this also very closely links to the representation of class. It is the middle class characters that are represented in a slightly more positive way. And it's the lower class characters that are represented involved in crime and represented in a much more negative fashion. And this might target a more middle class audience. And actually, whether we've looked at the representations of police versus criminals, or young people versus adults, or working classes versus middle classes, men versus women, actually the representations of different social groups are very blurred in terms of whether they are positive or negative. At times it is clear that some of the characters we think are heroes and that we think are protagonists are also people who have much darker lives. And it starts to become very clear in this episode that we as an audience cannot tell who is good, who is bad. We cannot tell who we are supposed to sympathise with and who we are supposed to dislike. And so perhaps the overall message of this episode is that you really cannot tell who are the criminals and who are the good guys. So that was my easy to understand guide to representation in The Responder. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for other videos that might be relevant for you. And if you would like a video that I don't already have, leave a little comment below and I'll add it to my to-do list.